I just think that the arguments they're making overall, that juice has already been squeezed prior to the 90s. That is how I would put it. The arguments that they think hold a lot of weight, that juice has already been squeezed with arguments of the past.
Deep in the heart of Texas.
We're in the business of winning.
Don't bet against me.
I don't bet anyway.
Lose your life.
All right, so while I was gone, we are done with the 90s trended, of course. And I've just been busy at work lately, so I'll start making some more videos, and we'll start with this one. So I was on Dart Stream yesterday, recording this Monday, and the week prior they'd made a passing comment about we are done with the 90s, and it went over my head. I didn't get it. I thought, from the way they said it, I knew it was like an inside joke. It was some kind of inside reference to something, so I thought maybe it was about some debate or a video they had watched or a caller or something like that, right? And I could understand what it was about. We're done with the 90s, correct? Me being someone in terms of this sector of the interwebs, obviously I'm in the pro Jordan corner when it comes to these like GOAT debates, right? Which are just for fun, right? Nobody owns basketball, right? This is all for fun. And so I when I heard that, I already knew what it was, correct? And so yesterday or 2-3 days ago, Jimmy High Roller comes out with the video, which we're about to watch. I got on 1.5 speed, so it'll be as fast as possible. This might be a long video. It is a 25-minute video, so it'll be another 20 minutes at least. But real quick, right? So I saw Jimmy High Roller did a video on it, and I was like, holy shit, this is like an entire thing. This is like a thing, right? It wasn't just some kind of inside reference to some small niche on the internet somewhere. This apparently had gone viral. And so I already knew what it was. I already knew what it was about. I already knew what the talking points. I already knew what was coming, right? Because in order again, it's funny because they always say Jordan fans tear down. First of all, I'm not a Jordan fan. I could care less. I just objectively, as a basketball fan, I just think he is the best player, objectively, in my opinion, subjectively. So, I already knew what it was about, right? And I heard all the talking points. And what I was saying, it's funny, they say Jordan fans want to tear down other people, but we have to pick our guy that we're arguing for, right? It's not a knock, right? But then in the same breath, they will turn around and talk about how trash the 90s were, right? So I already knew the talking points, and once I understood what it was, I already know what it is. And so we're trying to make this video as quick as possible, right? So first of all, this feels lazy and astroturfed, right? I'm gone for a month or two, and it becomes a thing. I already knew what it was, right? So again, this has kind of been a small thing on the corners of the internet where they try to argue against Jordan. This is the only time I've heard it, and it comes up. And they never say it about Shaq. They never say it about Robinson. They never say it about Olajuwon, right? They don't say it about anyone else in the 90s. No one else. Just Jordan, largely, that I hear about it, right? And again, that's just my own biased opinion. But again, I would say I've argued it enough, debated enough, watched enough videos. I've never been out and about, and anyone's ever said the 90s were trash, right? And the next part of that, right, is it feels a little astroturfed, and I know where I don't know, maybe someone could fill me on exactly when it hit the mainstream and went viral while I was gone, or recently, this past week or two or whatever. Maybe a talking head said it. That's what it appears to be. Someone said we're done with the 90s, or they were talking about how the 90s, again, were plumbers and cab drivers, which, again, it feels astroturfed, lazy, and forced, because these are the arguments they make against the 50s and 60s, correct? And so that's lazy. You're just regurgitating a talking point after 30, 40 years have gone by. Like, it just mathematically does not add up, right? And Jimmy High Roller touches on that here, and he makes a good point. It's kind of how I feel. He also says some stuff I don't agree with, right? But before we start, why this is a non-starter to me is because largely the argument the meat of the actual reasoning of the argument and then the motivation of the argument don't add up, right? In my opinion. And again, I've debated pro Jordan, so in a way I've argued pro 90s in a kind of roundabout way for a while. And people, again, when you talk about eras, they talk about eras, and these are some of the things I've heard before, right? So in my opinion, the motivation of this largely is to bring Jordan down a notch. Again, I am not a Jordan loyalist, correct? That is just my opinion. We're just talking about a new age of social media. People are watching their king. He's about to retire here in a year or two or whenever. And in my opinion, that's just kind of how it's organically or not. I really don't care, right? And I'm not mad, right? This is just content for all of us to talk about. That's largely where I think the motivation of this "we are done with the 90s" is coming from. I think it is a way to water down the 90s in a way in the minds of people to say that, well, LeBron's not as accomplished as Jordan, but LeBron played against way better competition to such a magnitude that what he's achieved is more impressive than Jordan, right? That kind of thing. That's largely what I think. If you were to ask, what is the issue with the 90s? Why are you going at the 90s, right? I think if you really got down to it and you could ask people and keep pushing them, they would say they hear all these Jordan fans talk about how great the 90s were, or old heads as they would put it. But old heads largely probably think Jordan is the GOAT, right? So it's a lot of overlap. That's where I think the motivation of this is coming from. You get these debates, right? And again, the debate is Jordan versus Kobe, Jordan versus LeBron largely. Mainly LeBron and Jordan for today's crowd. And again, the angle is always you can't go directly at Jordan and his hardware, right? Or his achievements for the most part. There's very few people who can even approach that. So they have to go another way, and they have to go after the 90s era in a way to kind of cut a leg out from Jordan. That's my opinion. That's what I think the motivation is. That's where I think this has festered and blossomed from. That's my opinion, right? That's my sports take. That's why you watch. And again, I'm not a Jordan loyalist, for the love of God, right? I'm just not. I just, as a basketball fan, think he's the GOAT, right? And that's just how I feel. I can't help it, right? I can't help it. I watch the game, and that's what I see. And so that's that. But the actual reasoning of the argument of "we are done with the 90s," and it's important to keep the motivating factor in your head as I talk about this. They say that the overall athlete is not as good. There are other things to it: skill, style, nutrition and health, whatever, right? Whatever else the other arguments are. But the bulk of it, the meat of it, is that the average athlete today is just so much better, or is largely better and more skilled, some combination of that, to the point that it is so different that the 90s can't even be compared at all to today's game. Largely is what it, maybe not at all, but essentially they can't. The 90s are in the rearview mirror now, largely on an athletic and skill-wise level, right? And so I want to say that. And then with that being said, right, this was largely the argument they made against the 50s and 60s. And I don't know if these people feel that Jordan fans tear down the 50s and 60s, so now they feel like they're doing it to him in a way. I feel like that might be a little part of it, but I can't actually get into like the logic behind it, or maybe the genesis within every person. Although I think the motivating factor, I stand by that. I think that is overall the motivating factor is Jordan. They hear Jordan fans and old heads talk about Jordan in the 90s, and that's what they that's like what they're going at. But why I don't think it holds up with the athlete, right, is because the reasoning is regurgitated. The whole plumbers can't play, right? And that was largely because, look, in the 50s and 60s, right, the racial makeup of the NBA is what it is, right? In terms of that was largely what that argument came from. People got taller, or more athletic, more skilled as time went on, right? And we're going to get into some graphs, and I want you to keep this part in your mind, right? From the 50s and 60s to the 90s, we're talking about leaps and bounds of magnitude difference of just the basic athlete, the average player, exposure, growth of the NBA, economic and monetary incentive, correct? Life-changing money. It's now become much more global, right? All through this time. And so the argument would then be to use this same argument that they are now is that we've done that again in the last 30 years, right? We've done that again. And I just don't think it holds weight. I just don't think it holds weight. It's almost like 20 years from now, we're going to be saying, well, LeBron played with a bunch of Uber drivers and podcasters and YouTube creators, right? It doesn't really count, right? It's just, it doesn't hold weight in terms of the athlete, right? The best players in the world were still, for the most part, playing in the NBA in the 90s and mainly the 80s. Maybe not so much in the 80s, but definitely during the 90s, a huge international explosion, right? And then usually, right, and Jimmy High Roller hints on this, we usually talk about the best of the best in terms of eras, right? And so I do not buy this argument that people like David Robinson and Jordan, remember, largely, this is what I mean. If you're going to make it an athlete argument, you're insinuating then, because your motivating factor, in my opinion, is Jordan, and you're making the athlete argument as your reasoning. Those two things do not add up for if you are coming at it from an anti-Jordan point of view, or you're trying to undermine Jordan. Your argument is kind of that Jordan could not translate to today's game. No one believes that. No one believes that. Jordan is an athlete by any day standard, right? It will have to be 1,000 years from now when we're literally flying over the court with our telekinetic power and telepathy or whatever, and we're able to just put the ball in the hole from 1,000 yards away with our mind or whatever, right? I'm just being silly, but again, to act as if the athletes of the 90s, couldn't keep up or something physically. I just, again, he kind of mentions here the lower end of the roster, maybe, but is that really what you're hinging your argument on? No, you're hinging your argument on essentially that like the starting five of NBA teams in the 90s essentially wouldn't be able to make roster spots today or even ride the bench, correct? And that's where, in terms of an athletic standpoint, right? That's what they're saying, is that they are just so athletically, so behind athletically that they couldn't even sniff an NBA roster spot. Largely, that's kind of what the argument really boils down to, the reasoning. The athlete is just better. We'll get into the skill argument. That comes early in the video, but I just want to get that. I think, again, I see it from a debating point of view in a way from my past. You have to deconstruct it. It just doesn't really add up, right? Largely, the reasoning of the argument is that the athletes, and we'll talk about skill here in a second, but largely it is like an athlete point of view, right? When it comes to the skill, there is a difference between hasn't happened or didn't happen and can't happen and won't happen, correct? What do I mean by this? To act as if someone like a Tim Hardaway couldn't learn a step back, you're telling me they're so athletically inferior, he can't learn a hezzy or a step back or a spin or a behind the back, or he already had the crossover, so we don't even have to go over that, right? That's kind of what you're going to have to base your argument on, is that athletically, that's just a skill argument, right? Let's put that to the side, right? Is this someone who was athletically gifted as Tim Hardaway and quick, couldn't learn moves in today's NBA, growing up in today's style, right? That's my point of the skill, right? Because Tim Hardaway didn't have an ISO game and it didn't happen, doesn't mean it couldn't happen. Those are two different things. I want to make that clear, right? But I just want to get out the gate that the whole thing is a non-starter to me, because they say that athletically and skillfully the players essentially just can't even keep up athletically, like of let's just say the starting fives in the 90s. And the motivating factor is that I think, in my opinion, that this is largely trying to undermine Jordan in some way with the LeBron current generation aspect, whether they'll admit it or not, or kind of say it or not, or they might explain it in a different way, right? But it's essentially hearing the old heads talk about Jordan in the 90s, and they're saying, man, we're done with the 90s, right? This is the new era's response to the old era. It's a story as old as time, right? Let's get that out the way, right? This is what I mean, where it's really not a big deal to me. It's not, but it's interesting. It's fun. We'll cover it, right? So that's just mine. It's a non-starter. Jordan athletically could definitely play if that's your motivating factor. And so therefore to say that athletes couldn't play in the 90s or keep up, the reasoning and I think the motivation is their downfall here, in my opinion, right? Time will tell. We'll see what happens, right? But I think that's largely it, right? And largely when we talk about eras, we're talking about the best. No one's making an argument hinged on the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th roster spot, right? So that's also needs to be kept in mind. So let's watch.
My brothers, we are in the midst of a civil war. The age-old debate of past versus present has reached critical mass, and sides have been taken. A revolution is taking place, and we're losing good men. Old school versus new school. Back in the day versus modern day. A story as old as time itself. I tried to ignore this bloodbath, but just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, it all got so much worse.
We done with the 90s.
Film of NBA games from the 80s and 90s coming to light, showing that the good old days were in fact not that good. This whole time, the punishing defensive legend was actually just a bunch of plumbers camping out in the paint looking for someone to hack. Shots clanking off.
Okay, so it's just important to note that's what it is, right? So that the average guy, or after the 1 and 2 on a team, they were just plumbers.
The backboard.
And again, it just feels lazy. Like this is what they said earlier, right? It just feels lazy.
Running around aimlessly, wreaking havoc. And worst of all, Michael Jeffrey Jordan, the supposed greatest basketball player of all time, didn't even have a left hand. What is going on? Have we been lied to?
You see what I mean? When something like that just pops up, and again, where does this start? This starts from that one clip. Either maybe it was the Jordan rules, or there's that one clip of a guy saying he stripped Jordan going to his left, or he knew Jordan couldn't go left, or something like that, right? And it's always like these little things or one instances. And if this is what we have to go to, right, where now it's like Jordan doesn't have a left, what is going on? Like what's happening all of a sudden, right? It's just kind of the guy with all the points and the rings and the MVPs, and the guy that we argue for about why he's so great. Oh, he didn't have a left. I'm cooked. I'm absolutely cooked now. What am I gonna do, right? So you're telling me he did all of that without a left hand? Holy shit, dude! Get this guy a left hand, he'd win 12 rings.
About basketball in the 80s and 90s? Are we really done with that era of hoops? Or are we being deceived by lowlights, misinformation, and cherry-picked clips? Well, I think I've got an answer, and some of y'all ain't gonna like it. We done with the 90s. 5 simple words that have completely divided fans of the NBA. I've seen well-thought-out video essays, hard-hitting analysis, testimonies from past and present players talking about their experience in the league and how it's changed over the years. And none of those things managed to do what these 5 simple words have done in just a week. Soon enough, the clips came rolling in.
This is like the OK Boomer meme. This is what that is. It's the OK Boomer meme, right? In basketball form.
Of players from that era dribbling off their feet, throwing up air balls, and putting together moves that you might see at your local high school's JV game. So, for whatever it's worth, here is my long-winded take on this whole discussion. I want to begin by saying what this discourse has taught me more than anything else is that NBA fans today never actually took the time to go back and watch games of the past. Brothers, I have been harping on this for years, begging for fans of the game, whether you are new or have been watching for years, to just go back and watch full games. Not highlights, not clips, full-length games of eras from the past. And after seeing this discussion devolve into where it is today, it is clear to me that most people never take the time. I'm seeing countless fans have this sort of awakening as they're watching films of these old games, as if the footage was buried or lost, and it's finally being unearthed for the world to see. It's been right here on YouTube for the past 15 years. You mean to tell me the same fans who chime in with a full-blown thesis on the GOAT debate never spared the time to even watch the games they were referring to? I guess that does explain a lot. Now, I'd like to think I'm somewhere in the middle on this whole discussion. I have said on multiple occasions that players in today's NBA are simply more skilled than players of the past, which has resulted in bigger stat lines and...
Okay, this is the skill argument, right? Now, again, he doesn't elaborate, but essentially what the clips here and what it breaks down to is the more skilled debate, and maybe someone would like to challenge me on this or elaborate on it, right? But the more skilled debate comes from a massive emphasis on the ISO game, correct? One thing even Jimmy admits and most people admit is that from the 90s to that 2000s, that era, right? It was much more strategy and team ball movement, correct? More so than, the pick and roll, backdoor screens, right? It was much more of that than spread it out, let a guy go one-on-one, right? So that is largely where this skill debate is, right? Guys are doing spin moves, hezzies, step backs, crossovers, and then hitting threes from the logo, right? And this is where the skill argument comes into play, right? essentially shooting more threes and crossing people up. I mean, really, it is almost like a hybrid of and one with shooting from the logo. Like, that is what people consider to be more skill. I mean, now that I say that, it really is like, can we somehow legally put the and one mixtape tour into the NBA, because people love to see that shit, right? Everyone loved watching the and one mixtape tour back in the day. Don't lie to me, right? So I think it has become a hybrid of that, right? It really has, in terms of this ISO. He's got handles. He's got a bag, as they say, right? That quite literally is what they mean. And he can hit a step back three. And again, it's just different. And so this is what I mean by there's a difference between it didn't happen or hasn't happened, and it couldn't happen and it won't happen, correct? You're telling me that someone like MJ or Tim Hardaway or someone of that nature, right? Because usually we're talking about guards now. Let's just be clear. Like, this is also something that's important to note between this ISO ball from the 90s, 80s, and 90s to today. It's important to remember the emphasis on the big man versus the guard, right? And again, that's largely Michael Jordan who did that, which is kind of ironic. But again, the largely it is that guards are ISOing up and can do a lot more things in terms of moves. Maybe ability, this is where, again, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it couldn't happen. To think that someone like Tim Hardaway, if he grew up today, couldn't hit a step back three or wouldn't shoot more threes or couldn't develop a hezi or a step back, or he already had the crossover, right? So this is what I mean, where it was just a different style. And I'm going to go again to the ISO, right? The ISO in the 90s was the inside out. It was the post move. It was a post up, more or less is what I meant to say. That was the ISO of the 90s. It was the post up game. That's what the ISO was. It was dump it down low to the big man, right? And secondly, again, this is like the emphasis on the guard. Guards just didn't ISO back in the day. It wasn't the emphasis of the game. It wasn't the strategy. If you shot a three from the logo, you'd get pulled, right? So there's that. And then also, when it comes to Jordan, to act as if Jordan's 18 to 20 foot mid-range game wasn't an ISO would be an absolute, it'd just be a lie. You'd be lying straight through your teeth if you told me that Jordan's ISO game or Jordan's mid-range game wasn't an ISO game. 100% it was. In my opinion, there's no question about that, right? He's ISOing the guy out, reading the defense, seeing if they're going to come double, what move does he want to make. It was just a different form of ISO than back him up, space it out, really put him on an island, 25, 30 feet out from the basket, and I can hit it from here. It's just different, right? It's just a different game. And so that's why the skill argument, I just don't buy into it. To think that, again, Tim Hardaway or guys wouldn't be shooting hundreds of threes a day if that's what the game was, and they wouldn't be learning these moves, or that they were so athletically inferior that they couldn't do it. Do you understand? Like, that just does not translate. Do you understand? It just doesn't translate. I don't think it holds much weight, and that's largely what it is. When they elaborate and they say skill, they essentially mean that it's ISO. Like, they have an idea of like an ISO. A Kyrie Irving essentially is a good example. That's what they picture in their head, right? And what was the other thing? Oh yeah. Again, to then use this ISO image that they have in their head and extrapolate that to almost every player in today's league is also a fallacy. The guys doing ISOs are still the best players on the team, the best one or two players, right? And again, this is where it's like Rex made the good point. Look at how 3-point shooting has evolved, and it's the way you win today. Well, the only team who did that had the best 3-point shooter of all time, right? So, like, again, it's not necessarily the 3-point shot that's different or winning it, if that makes sense, right? So when they picture this more skilled player, what they're envisioning is the stars on the team playing a more ISO form of basketball, and they have a deeper bag 30 feet away from the basket. That is largely where it comes from, in my opinion, right? And they act as if every player on the team is doing this, right? They act as if every player's got a killer crossover. They act like every player can just hit his angles and get to where he wants offensively, right? It's just there's still specialists. There's still guys who do what they do. And again, the big body argument that he mentioned in the beginning, it's an inside-out game. Your center and your backup center and your forward's going to have to rotate over. They're going to be bumping bodies all night and posting up in the post and getting hit and taking damage and banging, right? That's what they're doing. You need extra fouls. Like that was the emphasis on the game, right? And so this is what I'm saying, where it just because it didn't happen or hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean that it could not have happened, right? There's a big difference with that, right? If you want to tell me Bob Cousy can't dunk, or he can't catch an oop and throw it down backwards, okay, you got me, right? Maybe a lot of guys back in the day couldn't do that. That argument goes away in the 90s, if that makes sense. Like the athleticism argument just doesn't add up. And the skill is different. It's just a different form of basketball.
Higher point totals than ever before. It's not the defense that has gotten worse, it's the offense that has gotten better. You know, that whole spiel. But I also have an appreciation for the greats that came before and how incredible some players of past eras were. In fact, I almost feel like I'm hallucinating seeing this 90s basketball slander campaign unfold in front of my eyes. It feels like everyone's perception on the age-old debate changed literally overnight. I know that's not the case, but after seeing
That's why I feel a little astroturfed, or I'm not sure who said it. I'm assuming an announcer said it and it just caught fire. But again, in these circles, modern social media, right? The debate of basketball is LeBron and Jordan. So in my opinion, that's where this all stems from, which is fine, whatever.
seeing all of this play out, it sure feels that way. But today, I'm not just going to show you some cherry-picked clips or unhinge this narrative even further. I'm going to show you real film, real data, and proof of how we might actually be done with the 80s and 90s. And of course, if Michael Jordan really had no left hand. Spoiler, he did. Now, I have been an advocate for the modern players are better than players of the past movement for quite some time now. In fact,
what does that mean? Again, it's just ISO game. It's just an ISO game of the best players instead of running an offense through the best player, if that makes sense.
As crazy as it is for younger fans to say Michael Jordan was trash, it's just as absurd for older fans to say the game hasn't evolved and gotten better over the last 30 years. Because that's all this debate really is. Young fans versus old fans, or fans that watched this versus fans that are watching this. But objectively, players today are much better than they were in the 80s and even the 90s.
By why? Explain it. Elaborate.
Specifically, the lower end of the talent pool in the NBA today is vastly better than it was in the past. I think great players would be great in any era, but with the spacing...
I see, this is one of the things, like, so the argument hinges on the guys at the end of the bench. Like, I just think it's a weak argument if that's part of it. Today's game is so much better than 90s because the guys at the 9th, 10th, and 11th and 12th spot are just far superior than the guys in those spots previously.
The shot making, the emphasis on offense as opposed to defense has made the depth across the NBA today just way ahead of where it was in the 80s and the 90s. There was, without exaggeration, guys in the NBA throughout the 80s and 90s.
Again, it's just a different, and then you think about the 90s, it was so methodical. It was just so methodical. You were trying to use all 24 seconds and you were trying to get a layup and one or something. That was the game. It was to get as good of a shot as you could while using as much time as possible. That was largely the thought process.
90s that were on NBA rosters just to accumulate fouls and sit in the paint and be big. Some of these players were offensively inept.
Because that's what was needed, right? This is what I'm saying. Like, if you want to, this is what I mean, where this is actually a good kind of point, depending on how you see it, right? We're talking about schemes in different eras. The best of the best, like he said, play. So how do you scheme the rest of your team? Well, you fill those last few spots with areas you're weak at or things you might need extra of, right? And each era would be different for those guys at the end of the bench, right? Maybe back in the day it was, we need as much size and extra big bodies that we can get. We need those 6 fouls. We need those 6 fouls, right? 100%, we need those 6 fouls and we need them bad. And we need someone who can just put his hands up in the air and stand in the way and alter a few shots, right? That's literally what those extra guys were for, right? And what do you do today? Today is, I want another 3-point shooter. I need another ball handler. It's just a different, it's just a different scheme and strategy.
And that was okay because their role was not to create offense. But in today's NBA, where offense reigns supreme, there is no room for these players. Now, you could and should go back and watch film of games, not highlights, from this era and see just how limited the skill sets of some of these players were. The shot making, for the most part, was limited to set jumpers, slashers coming downhill for layups, and big men trying to muscle their way to a bucket down low in the midst of what appears to be a wrestling match. Catch a player off guard with a double team, and they immediately pick up their dribble. Simple things like guards turning their back to the basket 20 feet out instead of creating space off the dribble. Even players...
Again, this is like the John Stockton thing, right? The guy, Gary Payton's talking about how that rookie's on his team. And he's like, this is a blessed day for you. This is a good learning opportunity or something like that. And it's Mr. Stockton to you, right? And he talks about how Stockton just hit his angles, nothing flashy, just boom, boom, boom. And he'd walk him down to the free throw line and get inside the 3-point line, right? It's just different, right? And again, he's not thinking, it's not so much that he's walking you down, turning his back, because he has the complete ineptitude to be able to dribble. It's that he's trying to get to his spot where the offense starts. That's how that worked in the 90s, correct?
Looking down at the ball.
In today's game, it's like, I'm going to come down. I'm just going to kind of feel it, maybe call for a pick. I'm going to try and cross them up, right? It's just a different execution.
While trying to get out on a fast break was very common in this era. And these aren't lowlights or cherry-picked incidences. This is just what the game looked like 35 years ago. But even without film, nearly every metric suggests modern players are more capable of players in the past. Free throw percentage was worse, 3-point percentage was worse, turnover percentage was higher. They used to shoot more free throws, but still ended up with far less points. Now,
all right, I was dying to get to this point. You guys know I love numbers, right? Okay, these all go from 1980 to 2024, and a few of these are fair points, I guess you could say at the end of the day. But again, I want to go over each one, right? Free throw percentage, correct? Again, we have a dip in the 90s, and we're talking about 72, 73% at its lowest point. And in today's modern age of hyper focus on shooting, it's 78, 79, right? And really throughout the 90s, the average is more like what, 74, 75 maybe. So again, we're talking about in the 20s, right? The average so far would be like what, 78, 79. So again, 4 or 5% difference. It's just, you know what I mean? This feels like a cope. This feels like a cope because you started to run your mouth saying the 90s were trash, right? And they were so bad. And largely you did it because you wanted to undercut Jordan in some way. Again, this is just my opinion, right? So when I say that, if you disagree, it's fine. I just have that is what I think the origin story of this is. And so then you're like, well, how can I construct ways to undermine him? Well, obviously we'll go after the 90s and look at what the player, we've all seen the evolution of the game, right? There's no denying what I just explained the last 5 minutes with the skill argument, right? There's no denying those sort of evolutions of the game. But there's a difference again between, because it's happening now, that the guys back then couldn't do it. It was just a different style, right? And so then they start to pull up the numbers. And what is the difference? Man, so much, they're just these incredible. There's the shooting. The shooting is just incredible. And you go to free throw percentage and you go, okay, we got a low of 72 here and a high of 79, 7% difference. Really, the average is more of what, maybe like a 4 or 5 or something like that. Okay, I mean, okay, all right, what else you got, right? I'll give you the 5% free throw difference. We're still not that big of a deal, you know, again, all things considered. But what else do we have? The 3-point percentage. Okay, first of all, the three-pointer was still new in the early 80s, right? So you look at 3-point percentage, and what do you see? This is what I'm talking about, where the numbers, it's funny seeing them on a graph like this. Look at this exponential increase. This is not to say. Look at this exponential increase here. Up until what? The early 90s, and it starts to tap out. You're squeaking out a percentage point now, maybe per year or every 2-3 years, right? And this is what I'm saying, where this is what's incredible, is this era here in the late 80s that sees it jump 10%. Now we're talking differences here. Do you understand? Like, this 5% difference, right? When, let's call it 5%. Is it significant? I don't know. Things could explain it. That's like within a margin of error. 10% difference. This is like an anomaly. This is what we're talking about here, where you can make an argument. And so, yes, you had this spike here when they shortened the 3-point line. But even if we just average it out, right, throughout the 90s, it just keeps going. You're still squeezing out some gains here, right? So at the end of the 1999-2000 era, or the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, 99-2000, this little plateau here, and it's around 35%, 36%. And today we're at 37, it looks like. Looks like it's a 37. 2%. Like this is 2, 3, 4% in a hyper-focused shooting era versus the 90s. You guys are hanging on 2 to 5%. You know, it's just this feels like you started saying something and you had to pull something out to be like, wow, look, you know, these are not differences. This is what the athlete argument. These differences are marginal at best. At best. Turnover percentage. What do we got in the 90s? We got what looks like what? Let's just call it a 14 and a half average over the 90s. And now we're at 12. One thing I definitely hear around the water cooler a lot, and this is true, is everyone's constantly telling me that the reason why today's game is so much better is because the turnover percentage is 2.5 points less. And that's just a far superior athlete and skill of today's game is the 2.5%, the 2 to 2.5% difference. That's what they've been telling me. Do you understand? Like, this is just not, these don't hold any weight, right? And again, we talk about a more free-flowing, open game, ISO game. There's not going to be as many turnovers. There's not as many passes. You know what I mean? There's not as much emphasis on team defense and kind of kicking it out and working within a system and making 10 passes a possession, right? It's just, again, these 2.5% when you think about the difference in style, same with the free throw and 3-point. I wonder why I didn't put field goal percentage on here. I bet the field goal percentage is about the same. I would be hard pressed to think it'd be much different. Free throws per field goal attempt, right? So this is to imply that it is a cleaner game, something like that. The guys are more skilled and they're just simply putting the ball in the hole. Again, posting up in the 90s, going to the hole, you're going to get more free throws. That was the whole point. A big part of my game was someone who could not run past anybody, could not get around or jump over anyone, right? I'm looking for contact going to the hole half the time minimum, right? When I pump fake, I'm the guy who jumped into your chest to get the foul call, right? Like that's the game, right? You are a shooter, use it to your advantage 100%. And so this thing of like, oh, well, look how much cleaner it is. Well, even then, what are we talking about here? Caught about a 23, 24 to what is now like a 20. Just like, it's not a big difference. It's not enough to be like, wow, look at the skill.
That this era of hoops was trash. That's just disingenuous and flat out wrong. These were the best players in the world at the time. It was just simply not as good as what it is today. But maybe there's another layer to this that needs to be factored in to really understand why these players were not as skilled as the players of today. Now, despite this being a very relevant topic for years, the idea of rule changes and how these changes have affected the game still remain a mystery to some. Players were a product of their era and the rules of their era. The first step to discovering greats of the past is to watch film of them play. The next step is to gather and understand the context of the film you are watching. When you see a 6'9" Magic Johnson go flying down the court with what looks like kind of a stiff dribble, you may think the man has no bag. But my friends, Magic Johnson did have a bag, but the rules in place at the time only allowed him to reach so far into it before he got called for every violation in the rulebook. Consider the fact that any move where your hand wasn't completely on top of the basketball was considered a carry. No 0 steps, no gather steps, you get 2 steps, and anything more was called a travel. No backward shuffles to create separation, no lunging into players to draw easy fouls.
Isn't that crazy?
Here's a clip of Danny Ainge hitting Kevin McHale with a hezzy in the mid-80s. And the man thinks he just witnessed witchcraft.
But when practice sessions were completed, some of the most competitive competition began.
Do you see what I mean, though? Like, you see this, and this is archaic. This is like Jurassic compared to today. Do you understand? That doesn't mean that like they couldn't play or they couldn't learn the rules of today, right? But you're right. Like, this is where I think this is a lot of the miscommunication here, right? Is there's a difference, yeah, exactly, between what you have seen and what was allowed, right? And so this is why. But what's interesting is watching this, right? They're going through the process. You can see the bending of the rules beginning, right? In something like this, where what can you get away with, right? Think about how long, like, things about like a delayed pickup and what all you could get away with that. I remember me trying a few things with the delayed pickup to see what I could get away with at times, or an extra long delay or something like that going to the hole. Like, everyone, this has always been a thing of trying to like bend the rules and what you can get away with, and people try new things. This is how it starts, like this. Is guys in a gym, or something like that, and they're playing, they're talking about it. What can I do this? I saw a guy do this. It's just different.
Here's some more clips of players getting called for travels and carries doing moves that are very typical and allowed in 2024. 90% of the moves you see today, the very method most players generate their offense, would be called for some sort of violation 40 or 30 or even 20 years ago. And this isn't just some cop-out or excuse as to why these players of the past weren't doing this stuff. The rule changes are real, documented pieces of NBA history. You can literally look them up. The game got looser, players grew up and shaped their game around these looser rules. And
yeah, see, this is why I don't. How can you say then that they're better? Again, it's a different style. They're playing under a different tent, right? They're playing in a completely different environment. So when you say that they're better, I think the way people interpret that is you're saying that Tim Hardaway couldn't have developed a bag, is largely how they take that, right? And so this is when they say, people like me would say, of course Tim Hardaway could develop a bag. Like, I've seen Tim Hardaway play. If he grew up in today's league, he would have a bag.
now they have free reign to let their basketball bag run wild. But that's kind of the point. Players of the past didn't grow up practicing 25-footers. They didn't work on a dozen moves to create separation. They played in offensive systems that focused on the team, the collective, schemes and sets that resembled something closer to college basketball, where ISO possessions were few and far in between. So they never developed an arsenal to counter these situations. The rules of the time limited their game, which resulted in them having a more limited skill set than players today. If Larry...
Yeah, dude, like, for sure, yeah. We hired you to do what we hired you to do, right? That's definitely, and now everyone feels like they can do a little bit of everything. But as I went, that's not really how it is. But yeah, it's definitely like guys were good at a few things, and they were really good at a few things, right?
Bird grew up with a three-point line. He might have been the greatest long-range shooter ever, but he didn't. And as a result, he didn't shoot a lot of threes, and he wasn't as efficient as the best shooters today. We can sit here and assume these players of the past might be as capable as players today if they were playing under the same rules and conditions, but they didn't. And I don't think we should assume that. The fact is, they played in a different time, and they became a product of that time. But that's not to say the game was trash back then, or that the superstars of these eras couldn't compete in today's league. Now, as time goes by, I think it's easy to forget just how long ago 1980 was. 44 years ago, if my math is correct, which is in fact a very long time ago. In 1985, Magic Johnson won an NBA title, Larry Bird won the league MVP, and Michael Jordan won Rookie of the Year. That was 39 years ago from today, which is the same exact amount of time that has passed from that 1985 season to the year the NBA was founded.
This is a good point. This is my point about the athlete.
In 1946. Look at these clips. Do you think these players could compete with the likes of Bird, Magic, and Jordan? Let me answer that for you. No. But take the best players of the 80s and 90s, and could they compete in today's league? Absolutely. Give these guys some credit.
This is what I mean. That's a perfect encapsulation of why I don't think the athlete is so much better today. I don't think that argument holds any weight. If it holds weight, it is not enough to say we are done with the 90s. Does that make sense? It's not enough to puff your chest out about this kind of comparison and topic.
This today is the equivalent of watching this in the 80s, and yet this product is vastly closer to the basketball we see today than this product was to what fans were witnessing in the 80s. In fact, we can use different superstars as sort of a cross-generational measuring stick to see just how stiff the competition has been over the years. Larry and Magic played Michael, who played Kobe, who played LeBron, who has played the players of today. And nowhere down this timeline was there any real jump or fall off in production or level of competition from one era to the next. Each era had their stars. Those stars crossed paths with stars of other eras, and no one era was clear-cut ahead of the other. If the 80s were so bad, then why did players of the 90s have to wait for those guys to get old and retire to have a shot at winning? And if the 90s were so bad, then why did players of the 2000s not win until those guys retired? We don't need to assume that adjacent eras could compete with one another.
Exactly. That's a good point.
because we actually saw it. MJ struggled with some of the guys that came before him. Shaq struggled against Hakeem, and Kobe struggled against MJ. LeBron struggled against guys like Duncan and Dirk. And players of today have struggled to get past some of the older players in the league who are a product of the previous era. Now, what we shouldn't do is jump 3 or 4 eras at a time, ignoring entire decades of evolution and saying the game back then was better or even as good as it is today.
But he didn't say the game was better. He said the player is better. But the same argument is why that's not true either.
At a certain point, the knowledge and wisdom that comes from actually witnessing decades of NBA history, like some older fans have, becomes skewed and watered down by nostalgia and a generational bias. Superstars are superstars because their game transcends the era they played in, but they also played in an inferior league. These two ideas are not mutually exclusive, and although generational talents of the past would do just fine today, this same logic does not apply to the vast majority of the league throughout the 80s and 90s. So if the 80s were inferior to today's league and the 90s were inferior as well, when did the NBA become not trash? Well, it depends on how you look at it. Ironically, I think there's a pretty clear distinction to the skill set of players before Michael Jordan hit his peak and after. For example, the early 90s and late 90s, although being in the same decade, were massively different in play style and skill set. Think for a second about the fact that Magic Johnson was still in his prime in the early 90s and Allen Iverson was entering his prime in the late 90s. In less than 10 years, basketball became a massively different game. By the late 90s, the players who grew up watching Jordan fly through the air and slice up defenses were in the league and were reshaping the role that perimeter players played. Guys like Kobe Bryant, Allen Iverson, Ray Allen, Stephon Marbury, Grant Hill, Tracy McGrady, Vince Carter, all these guys came into the league around the same time and were products of what they saw MJ do throughout his career. Players with a skill set that more closely resembles what we see today than it did to the skill sets of players of the 80s and even early 90s. This is where I think most fans might make the distinction of when the league really took a leap not in competitiveness, but rather play style. You can go back and watch these guys play, and it's not too different than watching an NBA game today. Or you can point to the shift in play style that happened in the late 2010s, after Steph Curry redefined what makes a great championship caliber player, and the league adjusted to this new three-point heavy perimeter-focused style of basketball. Similar to Jordan, the kids who watched what Steph was doing in the mid-2010s emulated that style of play, tailored their games to it, and are now in the league doing things that only Steph could do a decade ago. So if we're done with the 80s and 90s, where can we look back and no longer apply this era tax on these players?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think we're talking about such marginal differences of an athlete and skill-wise that really the difference is the styles of why these guys have evolved the way that they have, right? And so that's why we're done with the 90s. It's like their argument hinges on the last few guys on the roster saying those guys are way better now and that they shoot more threes and have a deeper individual bag, right? And the thing is, like, those things don't translate to the 90s either. If these guys played a 90s team, you know, you'd have to understand that one team is playing as a team more than the other. You'd have to admit that the 90s team is probably coming in with a play set, a deeper playbook, right? More situational sets, more strategies, you know. They're more focused on the scheme, right? And so they will find a scheme, again, to try and stop your best player as a team. And I just feel like it's just a different brand of ball, right? And so this is where I don't think the athlete is much different from the 90s. To say that the skill set is so far different that those guys have no idea how to do what they're doing now, I don't really agree with that either. Again, looking even at the difference in the free throw percentage, a difference in the 3-point percentage, right? By the time you leave the 90s, the 3-pointer is what it is, right? The percentage is what it is. They have squeezed out a few more percentage points, right? With the heavy 3 league that we're now in. That's not, you know what I mean? That's insignificant. That's a marginal difference at best. Can be explained by other things, right? More than the I don't know, the guys today have just better eyesight or something, you know, like that's what I mean, where what is it that makes them better? It's just the style that they're looking at, and they have been filtered to play this style, which is, like I said, it's much more like and one with a step back 3, right? It's just different. And so it looks flashy, but we're talking about playing the game of basketball. Does that matter in the 90s? Like, do those things translate? Do those things, if you were to take a guy like Damian Lillard in the 90s and just put him on a team, is he really the best player in the league? Because you think there's such a difference between how he played then and they play now? I don't think so. I think he's a sharpshooter. Absolutely. He's still an all-star, no doubt. All-NBA probably. But he still is what he is, in my opinion, in terms of today versus in the 90s. It's just one of those things where it's just when you say better, people hear that and they think you're saying like the athlete has evolved or something and is in 30 years. And it just, I don't think most people buy that argument, right?
I think most fans would agree that the turn of the century is where the modern era of hyper-skilled players began. You can say objectively that this era was not trash, and most players of this generation would do just fine in today's league. But if that is the case, then modern NBA fans are holding a ticking time bomb, and they might not even know it.
Yeah, they're going to look back and say LeBron played with podcasters and Uber drivers, you know?
When we are older,
these guys
and
weren't
a new generation
serious.
of NBA
They were
fans claim
focused
our
on their
favorite
mental
players,
health.
the guys
These
we
guys
grew up
weren't
watching,
real
are not as good as the
competitors,
players
you know?
of the future. What will you have to say? Right now, there is no one in the world who can shoot like Steph Curry. But inevitably, there will be. And eventually, there will be many players who can shoot like him. His records will fall, his percentages won't look as good through the lens of 2040, and although his legacy will be cemented, his actual game will be put into question. And based on the arguments I'm hearing today on why past players were trash, we will have nothing to say that will change their minds. We know that Curry was the first to do what he's doing. He is a pioneer of the modern NBA. We have context to back up our claims. But if we aren't willing to hear older fans out today, what makes us think younger fans will hear us out in the future? Mark my words. There will be a day when young fans will go back, watch film of LeBron, and say he couldn't compete with players of the future. In fact, it's already happening. Fans saying he has no bag. Younger players putting up bigger numbers than he ever did. Skill sets a bit.
Ironically, LeBron doesn't have a bag. He's got a 3-point shot and going to the hole and hoping his athleticism carries him, right? Like, that's my kind of. He's almost, again, in his younger day, he can maybe do a little more with the mid range and shoot fadeaways and stuff. He's kind of turned into a James Harden in a lot of ways offensively. That's, again, maybe people don't like that, but he shoots a three or goes to the hole. I mean, that's kind of largely what he does do. Even the shot chart bears that out too.
Deeper with games that look more polished. It's all fun and games now to crack jokes about past eras, but our day will come too, and it ain't gonna be pretty. But Giannis could only run and dunk. Your era was trash. Y'all had a dude who couldn't get 2 feet off the ground running the whole league. You can scramble to pull up clips and show.
Yeah, think about Giannis, right? How like the Greek freak, right? He's literally, you know, again, what is the difference between, I'm just going to kind of roughly use someone, right? What is the difference between him and David Robinson? You know what I mean? Maybe a little bit more of an open court runner for Giannis versus a more of a traditional center for Robinson. But athletically speaking, like that kind of thing, like people are like, man, Giannis is like, he's a freak. He's a Greek freak. And it's like, I think about looking at someone like David Robinson and like that guy's, I don't understand. You know, I'm looking at David Robinson and Giannis. I'm like, I've seen that before. You know, that kind of thing.
The numbers, but their minds will already be made up. This is why I think it is so important to have genuine, thought-out discourse about the game if you're truly a fan of it. But to all of the older fans out there, you kind of started this whole thing. For years, we heard y'all badmouth modern players.
See, this is where it all comes from. Like, this is where I thought it was all going to be the genesis from, is just this. This is literally the new generation wanting to try and water down Jordan. That's what the motivation is, man. Like, I really think that's what this all boils down to. And again, that's fine. I don't care. I honestly don't have a dog in the fight, right? Other than just my opinion that I think Jordan is better. But again, I don't care at the end of the day, right? I'm gonna wake up and go have lunch anyway, right? Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect my day.
Saying the league is soft, players today couldn't compete back then. Back in my day, real men played the game. Y'all cannot be mad that some fans are done with the 80s and 90s when y'all never even gave modern basketball a chance. Sure, a lot of fans never took the time to go back and watch the greats of the past, but let's be honest for a second. Older fans don't watch games today. They catch a
There is something to be said about the brand of basketball. We've kind of already talked about it. And again, you have to think just objectively as a fan, right? Is it more exciting to watch 10 passes of possession, pick and roll, players moving, crisp passes, and they're trying to work the ball into as close a shot as possible? Or is it more exciting to watch 10 guys run down the court and then 2 of them largely, I know this is not all the time, I understand that, but it's either an immediate fast break or it's pull it out and we'll watch, out of 10 guys, we'll watch 2 guys play, right? And again, I'm being a little facetious, I understand, but largely that is the style these days, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people would argue that, right? I'm not trying to be negative in any way. I think that's just, if you're watching it and you're thinking about it objectively, I think there is something to be said about watching a team orchestrate a possession versus a player try and show off his bag and score, right? Depends on overall, right? I think people these days like players more than they like a team's brand of basketball, right? Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Stray clip on Facebook of LeBron flopping and like an echo.
And if you played, right, I feel like more people these days have not actually played basketball at a competitive, at least high school, somewhat varsity level compared to back in the day. I felt like more people, it was like, yeah, I might have rode the bench or something, but I played all 4 years of high school or whatever, right? It just feels like, again, as it becomes more of an entertainment and obviously as it becomes more popular, obviously less and less people would have actually played competitive ball. But I think if you've actually played it, you want to watch the game orchestrated by a team versus team. And I feel like these days more people want to watch a star take over a game, and it's like this main character syndrome kind of thing, whether good or bad.
Echo chamber of disgruntled old men. They just start firing away in the comments, agreeing with one another. Y'all ask for this. I've been watching the NBA since the mid-2000s. Kobe, D-Wade, McGrady, Iverson, Shaq, Nash, those were my guys. But I can acknowledge those greats and say they were incredible, while also acknowledging that that version of the NBA as a whole was not as refined or as good as it is today. Now, will I be able to make that distinction in 20 years when some...
And I honestly think a lot of this particular part he's talking about here, I think it has a lot to do with the banana boat culture that they reference with Chris Paul whenever that whole incident happened with like the Clippers or whatever. I think that is where a lot of this rubber hits the road with this disagreement between, old heads and new age, right? It really does. I think they felt like guys were more loyal to a team in the 90s and early 2000s to a degree, guys like Dirk and Kobe for sure. And we're loyal to a team. We're going to stay and try and bring their city a championship. They wanted to play against each other. There were rivalries, right? And I think that's changed to a more friendly, lovey-dovey, that kind of ball, right? And it's a huge culture shift. It really is a huge culture shift, whether you agree with it or not, right? Whether you're on that one side or the other. It's a massive culture shift on a competitive level, right? That is honestly what I think the center of that friction between the new and old right now going on. That's ultimately what I think it comes down to, is the older generation largely, I think, wants to dismiss some of these younger guys because they feel like they are not I don't want to say like waiting their turn or like earning it, but something like that. They feel like they are taking the easy way out, or who knows how good they really would have been in the 90s had they had to stick around on an actual team, that the way the landscape was much more even in the 90s, right? Definitely with the salary cap and everything. What would this like average number 2 and 3 guy, right? I think that's what it is, right? They think like the average is kind of, maybe not the superstar is not so much a difference, but they think the average levels come up. Well, what would these guys look like on a team where they're the first option, right? Something like that, where they're the first or second option. I think that is the argument of the old heads, mixed with this new banana boat. I'm going to call it banana boat culture. If you don't know what I mean by that, you can look up Chris Paul banana boat or whatever. But they call it this banana boat culture, if you know what I'm saying. They call it this banana boat culture where guys want to be friends. No one wants to step on anyone's toes because they understand they got to play a game tomorrow against each other, and they don't want there to be friction because basketball gets heated and competitive, but they don't want to look bad. They want everyone to like them, right? Like, it's real. I have to admit, I hate that. Like, I have to admit, I don't like that. That being said, it's not like the guys today are bad guys, right? It's just a different culture. And again, I think the guys of the past, again, this is a huge culture thing, even in like even like as we go through time and in even everyday life and politics, the older culture, right, kind of, knocks on the younger guys. They don't work as hard, right? I think that's what this is. It's like back in the day, Larry and Magic on the court hated each other. They, metaphorically speaking, they wanted to crush each other, right? If they could beat each other by 100 points, they wanted to do it. And it was very hard for them to get over that, right? You have to think about it's kind of funny. This really might be the genesis of the whole banana boat culture. Might be Magic and Bird on some scale, right? In a weird way. But you remember, like, Bird and Magic, they didn't want to be friends at first, correct? The Converse thing kind of made them do it. But they didn't want to be friends because they knew they wanted every little edge over the other guy. You cannot like the other guy you're about to go play against, right? That is the big culture shift right now that people in the old don't like about the new. And the new generation, I think, is just this typical, and not to be mean or dismissive, but it's a lot of this, well, who cares, right? And it's like, that's kind of the rebuttal. It's like, so what if he chases rings, or so what if they team up, and like, it doesn't bother you, right? I think that is, to me, that is what this whole like friction is about, in my opinion, right? That's when they talk about the old guys did this. I don't think guys in the 90s would knock any generation before them for being tough, right? I think that is the culture shift that definitely has happened in terms of that landscape, and that's where, in my opinion, all of this stems from, is that, and of course, like, there's that in terms of when they talk about the players today. When we're talking about the average player, that's the narrative I'm talking about. That's the friction I'm talking about. In terms of this, we are done with the 90s. Again, I went over, I think the ultimate reason is that generational divide and that culture difference. And then also this is ultimately is a way to get LeBron over the hump of Jordan, in my opinion. Whether they mean to or not, or know it or not, that's where I think like this has all kind of mounted from, right? So that's just my opinion on that. That culture, that I'm really glad, I'm going to cut that out, that whole culture thing. That is the cultural divide right now in basketball.
Snot-nosed brat tells me my glorious king was trash. I'm not so sure. No, it's time to once and for all take a real close look at this accusation that Michael Jordan did not have a left hand. I felt like I was having just some high-level trolling, but
I didn't necessarily want to talk about this part, but there's one important part I want to talk about this, and this goes back to my Jordan debate when I made the video about the shooting percentages and that why Jordan is a better shooter than LeBron, correct? And
possessions throughout these games, charted when he went to his right, when he went to his left, and
so Jimmy High Roller charts his own games, but there is a piece in here where, again, he's better with his right than his left. That's the conclusion, and then he finds out that he's better with his left than essentially the league average, or most players going to their right. So this right here, right? So I just want to bring this up real quick because I had used some numbers in that video for like as another source of Jordan's shot chart, because I was trying to see how good of a shooter he was, but it wasn't a like percentage, or it wasn't a like by distance, it was by area, right? And so I used what I could from it, but I just remember that the GOAT James Kingdom guy is giving me shit because I used this exact shot chart here as one of my talking points in terms of how he shot previously. Before they didn't keep shot chart records until Jordan's last 3 years on the Bulls. That's when they started, I believe. And so anything prior to that, I searched for what I could, and this is what I found, was this exact shot chart.
Breakdown of Michael Jordan's shot chart and shot tendencies in 3 seasons from 1990 to 1992. 120.
So 1999-2, they haven't done the shot chart by distance yet, and they didn't start that until he came back for the second three-peat with the Bulls. That's when I think the NBA officially started the shot by distance.
Games and over 4,800 minutes in total, tracking exactly what Michael did on the court for 3 seasons. And here's what the data shows. In total, Michael made 1,074 moves in isolation, going either to his right or to his left hand. 48% of those moves were with his right hand, and 52% of those moves were with his left hand. When going to the right, Michael shot 61.7% on 410 shots with 15 turnovers, resulting in 1.38 points per possession. When going to his left, Michael shot 61.3% on 421 shots with 36 turnovers, resulting in 1.31 points per possession. So even with a much larger sample size, Michael not only had a left hand, he went to it just as often as he went to his right, and was nearly as proficient with his left left as he was with his right. Now, for some context, throughout this 3-year span, Michael made on average 4.4 left-handed isolation moves, or in this case, isolation possessions, that resulted in 1.31 points per possession. Now, here are some prolific scorers from this season and their overall tendencies and efficiency in isolation. Keep in mind, this data includes both right-handed and left-handed moves from these players. And now here is Michael Jordan with just his left hand.
You see what I mean? Like, guys, like, it gets so frustrating because we're talking, this whole argument amounts to the guys at the end of the bench aren't as good. Guys shoot more threes these days. The star players do more ISO than working in like a team strategy. Like it amounts to like all these little tiny things, and not all of them are within this margin of error where it can be explained, right? That it's just so it's like nothing is like this big hammer drop X factor that they think it is. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't. We have all the stats. The 90s are on all the film is on for anyone to see. We have all the stats. It just doesn't translate to a very good argument.
So, yeah. I'd say contrary to what has now become popular belief, Michael Jordan had a left hand.
This is ISO. His left hand ISO in the 90s is better than anyone today.
And
that's not a fluke. Like, that's not, you know what I mean? This isn't like some, he played some scrub, I guess, on defense or some plumber. Or, like, it's just a cope. It is a cope.
I believe we had to dig into the data to come to this conclusion. I think the overall idea that the 80s and 90s were a far less skilled time in the NBA compared to today is probably fair. I mean, you'd be crazy to think the game hasn't evolved in 4 decades. But to say the league was trash back then is just wrong. I think more than anything, it's the style of play and the way basketball games would unfold back then that really throws some fans off when they go to watch film of these old games. It's like looking at a box score from the mid-2000s and thinking everyone sucked because the games finished with final scores in the 80s. But the players weren't bad. It was just a different game back then. It was slower, more methodical, more team and scheme-based than it is today. And similarly, I think you could say the 80s and 90s had its fair share of bad basketball. But that doesn't mean all the players were bad, especially the superstars of those eras. That was just the state of the game they were playing in. I think some older fans have a skewed perception of how good the game was back then, but I also think they just genuinely liked that style of ball regardless of the evolution of the league. In 20 years, there could be a dozen players around the league that shoot like Steph Curry, but I doubt we will hold the same appreciation and affinity for those players as we did to the guy who pioneered this style of play and did it during the good old days. In the 90s, no one looked back at how the league was in the 60s claiming it was better, and so realistically, we shouldn't be looking back at the 80s and 90s claiming the league was superior than it is today, or even just as good for that matter. A lot of these ideas that favor modern basketball are becoming more main.
And that made me also think about something why some people might think the 90s and the 80s were the best. Mainly the 90s, what we're saying here, or these guys. I don't know what era is the best, right? I don't really have like a firm argument on that. Because it's like I would have to dive in real deep, every era kind of thing. I can't see all the games from like the 50s, 60s, 70s. I can watch some, I suppose, but anyways, I digress. But I think the thing that people, again, I'm trying to get into the head of the 90s guru fan, right? The diehard 90s fan, right? I think it was the culmination of the athlete with the team game. I think that's in the competitive nature was still there, right? Everybody wanted to beat each other. The salary cap era, the landscape is so much more spread out and even I think the 90s arguably is the most even level playing field of competition the NBA has ever seen. And my evidence to this would be go look at the Vegas odds preseason every year, right? And I've done this, and I should maybe do another video on this. But essentially in the 90s, right, you have a massive flattening and leveling off of the preseason championship odds, which I think are a decent indicator, that one of the better ones we could find, of what was the overall level landscape and competition of the game, right? In terms of a team talent average, right? And again, in 2011, again, the Mavs are the second biggest upset preseason wise of all time, right? The second biggest preseason odds. And that year they were like 5th or 6th. In the year that the Rockets won in 95 or 4, I can't remember, to get to the same odds as what the Mavs had, you have to go to like 12 or 14 down, right? So, I mean, this is what I mean where I think when people love the 90s, they feel it with the salary cap, that's a real thing. Preseason odds are a real thing. That the odds of any team winning it was better than ever before. It was much more leveled out. Really hard to get more than 1 or 2 All-Stars on a team. To have 2 All-Stars was, that'd be pretty good. To have one was, everyone had like a guy kind of thing. I think that's also what people think about. And you still had the team aspect very much a heavy part of it. And again, like I said, with the way things were, in terms of race back in the day and the average athlete and the exposure and the economic incentives, that it all, again, like the graph with the 3-point percentage, right? It gets to the 90s and then it quickly slopes off, right? Same thing with sort of this culmination of the athlete in the 90s. I really think it's like this culmination you really see in the 90s. I think the average athlete had come such a far way with exposure and getting guys from all around the world wanting to play and having basketball be the business that it had become, right? I think it is sort of this culmination of competitive fire and landscape with the athlete and the team game, right? That's how I would make my argument for the 90s of why it is. If you wanted to make the argument, it is the best era. It would be that we have seen we have squeezed as much as possible with getting the best average athlete in the world, right? With money and exposure, and we still have the team game that got us here largely, right? Ball movement, strategy, and scheme, things like that. Methodical, like he kind of said. That would be my pitch as to why the 90s would be the best if I was going to make that argument.
Mainstream as fans dive deeper into these topics and add context to narratives that have been floating around for decades. But I think this push to be done with the 80s and 90s is a bit overkill. We want to add context and nuance and knowledge to these discussions, not remove entire decades from it altogether. Sadly, I don't think any of this has or will change anyone's mind. This revolt against old school ball was either confirmation of what you already thought, or this entire discussion is just blasphemy to you. Are we done with the 80s and 90s? Maybe, but for the sake of the game and the greats that paved the way, I sure hope not.
All right, so that's my video. Thanks for watching. It's a long video, so I appreciate it if you watched it. But yeah, that's just kind of, I just want to give my thought. I guess an hour-long video is appropriate for such a big topic, right? That's going as big as it is, and it will never stop. It'll keep going each generation, right? I just think that the arguments they're making overall, that juice has already been squeezed prior to the 90s. That is how I would put it. The arguments that they think hold a lot of weight, that juice has already been squeezed with arguments of the past. And just much like the 3-point percentage, I think it's such a good encapsulation of my argument. I want to find it one more time. Just like you see with the 3-point percentage, right? This is my argument of the argument they're trying to make. That juice got squeezed right here. And do you have maybe some points? Yes, but the returns are so small on the arguments you're now trying to make, the same arguments against the 90s. It doesn't hold any weight. You're not getting any juice from that squeeze. Does that make sense? I'm trying to best like put an analogy on the arguments that they're making. And then largely with the skill thing, again, it's just, I think it's different, right? Again, I think Tim Hardaway is such a good example because not a lot of people think about him. But he had the killer crossover. He's got the quickness. He's got the lateral movement. He's a decent shooter, right? Have him growing up as a kid shooting step back threes, like he's right there. He's right there, right? So that's my opinion with, again, like he kind of said, the style of ball and the athlete we're seeing translates much better from the 80s and 90s to today than the 50s and 60s did to the 80s and 90s. That's largely kind of why this is. You cannot be hinging the GOAT argument or era arguments on such small margins of differences between things. That's kind of why you think that because you bring up a lot of tiny points that then it's going to amount to a big final resolution in your favor, but that's not really. It's kind of like a yes or no critical mass thing, right? Like if your argument is simply not pass the threshold, it just doesn't pass the threshold, right? And I think people think who kind of argue like this, they think that look at this and look at that and look at this and look at that. And they think that at the end of the day, they're going to say, look, I made 100 points. But if your 100 points only, if you need 1 pound to break the scale, but your 100 points only weigh out to 15 ounces, then it's not enough. It's within the margin of error. It's such a nominal small difference. It's just not, it doesn't hold any weight. It doesn't break through, right? That's the thing. So that's my video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Start making some more, but yep, see you guys on the next one.